Hello and welcome to another flipped classroom lesson from Students of History. This one is on our Gilded Age robber barons. Now, we have either a guided outline notes that you can follow along with or an interactive notebook style which you can cut, fold, and draw on. Either one works perfectly with this presentation. We're going to start out though with monopolies, because that's where all of this comes from. And this is in the Gilded Age during the late 1800s, and you had a huge influx of immigrants to the United States. This is after the Civil War has ended, so there's peace and prosperity in the United States, and as a result, a huge number of immigrants are coming from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe especially, and they're providing a great source of cheap labor for industry. Because at the same time, you had major advances in technology between the steam engine, the Bessemer process, the invention of the modern railroads. A lot of new advances in technology really quickly led to a very rapid industrialization in the United States. Industries springing up very quickly and being populated by cheap sources of labor led to people making lots of money, and at the same time, the government had a very laissez-faire. Now, laissez-faire is a French phrase. It means hands-off, and at this time, the government was very hands-off with industry. This kind of goes back to the early United States, where the government was much smaller than it is today. It had a much smaller influence on society. So there were no regulations on industry. Now, this is going to be very bad for many people eventually, but for a few people who could build industries very quickly and pay their workers very little, it's going to result in them creating monopolies. Now, a monopoly is when one company dominates an entire industry. In modern times, Microsoft was claimed to be a monopoly because they dominated the computer industry. This is before Apple became as big as it has. But you could think of if there was one social media company like Facebook dominating an industry, and imagine if there were no other social media companies. Now, back then, monopolies could be railroad monopolies, oil monopolies, steel monopolies, and some wealthy business leaders who develop these monopolies are going to become known as robber barons. Now, that's kind of a negative term, and it goes back to the Middle Ages and feudalism, when the baron would control his fiefdom, and the serfs and the peasants would owe their allegiance to these super powerful people. And that's what a lot of ways these business leaders who owned these monopolies were like. That's how they were seen. So they became known as barons. And kind of looking at some images from back then, here's a political cartoon titled "History Repeats Itself." In the top left, you have the peasants, the serfs, giving owing their allegiance to their baron and handing off their possessions. And then here in in United States in the late 1800s, you had the trusts. Now, a lot of times, a trust is another word in a lot of ways for a monopoly. And you had the farmers and the citizens and the workers bowing down before these robber barons and handing them their wages and their taxes and their allegiance from American society. A similar image shows our robber barons dominating the United States government. This is the U.S. Senate, if you can't tell at the top there. And look at these powerful, fat robber barons, the steel trust, the copper trust, you have Standard Oil there, there's a sugar trust in the back, coal. And if you look on the very top left, there's the people's entrance where the people would come to view government, and that's closed and locked. And the entrance for the monopolists is wide open for them to enter and dominate the Senate. This cartoon is from 1889. And it's been often repeated because you still have claims today that America's government is dominated by powerful business interests. And it was even more so back then because there was no real regulation on these guys, and these business leaders wanted to ensure that. Robber barons, they are going to exploit business practices, government influence, This cartoon here shows a business leader with obviously money for his brains, and this refers back to actually Tammany Hall and taking bribes from to exert business influence. Exploitive business practices are things like lowering your prices very low so people buy from you and your competition goes out of business, and then you buy up your competition and then jack up your prices. Other things are paying extremely low wages because there's so many immigrants arriving every day to the United States that they're willing to work for low wages. And with a laissez-faire government, there is no minimum wage. There's no rules about working hours. There's no rules about ages. So child labor is another exploitive practice back then. You're going to have children working long days, newly arrived immigrants working extremely long days in dangerous working conditions. Some factories were extremely unsafe. You had sometimes workers locked into their workplace, which would result in tragedies like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, where people burned to death. You're going to have very, very dangerous conditions. You're going to have these robber barons squashing their competition through any means necessary and creating monopolies where one company dominates an industry and then they can raise their prices. Now today, there's going to be laws against monopolies because it's bad. Competition is good because if you can go and, let's say, go to the mall and you have a whole bunch of stores to pick from, they're going to lower their prices to try to get you there. They're going to make the best products to try to get you to buy their products because they want your business. But if there was only one place to go, they could charge whatever they want. They could have poor products, and there's nothing you can do because that's the only one. So monopolies are really bad for society. They hurt people, and that's why they're illegal today. But back then, a laissez-faire government allowed it. So let's take a look at some of the most famous robber barons or captains of industry that you. And our first one, and we'll look at their homes as well to kind of see the fantastic wealth that they possessed. And our first one is Andrew Carnegie. You can see this is Andrew Carnegie's mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York, one of his many mansions and castles. There's Andrew. He owned a castle in Scotland as well, which is his home country. This is a scene from a dining room. Obviously, it looks like your middle-age, like Palace of Versailles or a king's castle. Andrew Carnegie. So Andrew Carnegie is a Scottish immigrant. He emigrated to America from Scotland as a young man. And he went on to found the Carnegie Steel Company. And when he was a young worker in a steel company, he saw the Bessemer process. And the Bessemer process was a way for making steel much stronger and cheaper at the same time. And he realized the potential of this Bessemer process more than anyone else, so that his steel company could produce the strongest steel for a cheap price. And this is at a time when cities are expanding, industries expanding, railroads are expanding, and all of them need steel. And he dominated the steel industry. And he's going to squash all competition. His steel company is going to grow to be the biggest in the world. And towards the end of his life, as you'll see with a lot of these robber barons, they're going to give back the money that they gave. Because he had a philosophy that he wrote about towards the end of his life, where he said the first third of your life, you should spend it getting as much education as you can through that first third of your life. The second third of your life, make as much money as you can. The third third of your life, the last third of your life, give it all away. And that's exactly what he did. He founded this Carnegie Steel Company, amassed to about $350 million in value. Now, he did see trouble during the time. There was a famous Homestead strike against his steel company, which was incredibly violent when workers went on strike. His profits were soaring, but he was still paying them rather low wages. And they brought in these Pinkerton detective agents, which clashed with the workers over a number of days. 20 to 30 people died, a lot of casualties. The workers were trying to form a union. It was totally dismantled. And he brought in new labor that would work for them, and it was a real blow to organized labor at the time. But Carnegie made millions and millions of dollars, gave a lot of it away, especially around Pittsburgh, where his steel company was. You think of the Pittsburgh Steelers. That whole name goes back to Andrew Carnegie's steel industry, Carnegie Mellon University, Carnegie Hall. A lot of times these names are famous because of all the money that these guys get. One of the most famous homes in America and the largest private home in America is the Biltmore Estate. It's in North Carolina, and this is one of actually many, many, many mansions from our next robber baron, Cornelius Vanderbilt. The Biltmore Estate, 1800s. Here's a fantastic picture of it from the front. Beautiful home. If you get a chance to travel to North Carolina, it's one of America's great attractions to go see it. You look at the inside, again, this looks like a absolutely stunning, massive palace for a king, right? With a triple fireplace there and the long table. Cornelius Vanderbilt, we see him here. He controlled railroads and shipping, the shipping industry, and he developed a monopoly on the shipping industry and a lot of railroads, especially in the northeastern United States, at a time when the railroad industry was growing. And as we'll see in a little bit, there are different kinds of ways to build monopoly. You can do it by buying up all your competition, and that's known as a horizontal integration because you're buying out everyone around you. But what Cornelius Vanderbilt did was he used something known as vertical integration. Vertical integration is where you control every part of something associated with your company. So sometimes, like if you think you make something in a factory, you have to get those goods out to stores. So you might use them, put them on ships, you might put them on trucks, you might put them on planes to get those to the stores. Well, with vertical integration, you own all of those. So you own the factory where goods are being made. You own the maybe boat or ship that you're shipping them to other places. You own the trucks that are then delivering those to the stores. And then you own the stores also. So every part of that kind of line from production all the way to sale, you own all of them. That's vertical integration. And that's what Vanderbilt did. He controlled the railroads, steel, the shipping, the transportation. He would even develop his own town of workers where he owned everything and developed fantastic, fabulous wealth. Homes. This is his vacation home in Newport, Rhode Island. It's known as the Breakers. It's still there today. Famous home. All of Newport, Rhode Island features a lot of these Gilded Age mansions. Owned the largest ever home in New York City. You can see here this top corner, it says it was actually the home of Mrs. Vanderbilt. Owned this mansion. This doesn't stand, this is not there today anymore. For some reason, this beautiful home was torn down. But this was New York's largest ever home. But what you have here, and you can see this is a worker tied to the stake of monopoly. And these, each one of the logs has a different either robber baron or government worker or government agent, politician, I should say, fanning the flames of fire. Vanderbilt's on there, Jay Gould, another prominent robber baron, is on there. Another guy named Roscoe Conkling is there on the top left. He was a politician who really helped these robber barons exploit workers. He was also he was like a bodybuilder, actually. Famous guy at the time, a Gilded Age character. If you want to look at a fascinating life, look up Roscoe Conkling. He was a fascinating character. But the worker is bound to the stake because anytime the workers tried to do anything, they tried to go on strike. The strikes would get broken up. They tried to protest. These protests would get broken up. They would try to form unions, and the unions would get broken up because these robber barons and government were so powerful that the workers really couldn't do anything during this time. And that's why you have these exploitive practices that are really it's going to take a long time for this to change until our next unit you'll see is the progressive era, when things finally do start to change. Well, our next robber baron is seen here, and his name is J.P. Morgan. You might hear the name J.P. Morgan today, but it's the name of a banking, and that's because J.P. Morgan was a banker, a financier, who financed actually a lot of A few will see he actually bought out Carnegie Steel. When Andrew Carnegie wanted to retire, he bought Carnegie Steel from Andrew Carnegie and formed the U.S. Steel Corporation and made it even larger and a larger monopoly. He was so wealthy that at the time the U.S. government, during an economic panic, was kind of teetering and in debt. He bailed out the U.S. government with a loan. Think about how rich you have to be to loan money to the government. And he is going to create eventually GE, which is General Electric, still a massive corporation today. So he is really dominating multiple industries: the banking industry, the finance industry, the steel industry. An incredibly, incredibly wealthy guy. Interestingly, you can see sort of in this picture, he hated having his picture taken. So this one from the side, he suffered from terrible rosacea on his nose. And you can kind of tell his nose there is very red and swollen and pockmarked. So he very much hated having his picture taken. And this one is just from the side, he likely didn't notice. Again, this is his home in New York City. Not as fantastic maybe as some of the other homes we've seen, still a massively large residence in New York. But he also owned his own private island, and this was his home on a private island just outside of New York City on Long Island. It recently sold for $125 million. This look at the home on that island. So owning your own private island, not too bad either. As we said, he bailed out the U.S. government. So take a look at this cartoon here. You have giant, big, strong J.P. Morgan rowing along with tiny little Uncle Sam, and really who's controlling the rowboat there and who's controlling who. You have kind of J.P. Morgan seen as much more strong and powerful than even the United States. Our last one is going to be the richest of them all. His name today is still associated with fantastic wealth, because he is known as the richest man who ever lived, and that is going to be John D. Rockefeller. This is his estate in New York as well. Kikuit was oftentimes these wealthy robber barons. They would have, and even today you have wealthy people who name their homes, and their homes, if it's so fantastic and large, it has a name and it's an estate, and that's what you have here. Here's a rear view going down to the gardens of Kikuit. Rockefeller. He lived to be 98. He was born 1839, died in 1937, lived an incredibly long life. He founded Standard Oil. Now his father, interestingly, was a con man. He was a con artist, a snake oil salesman who had kind of a double life with another family and was traveling around, and famously said that I cheat my boys every chance I can get. I want to make them sharp. So you can imagine the kind of father that cheats his own sons and is kind of a con man, and the things that John D. Rockefeller had to learn early on. And it worked. You know, it wouldn't work for everybody, but it worked for John D. Rockefeller, whereas he got in on the oil industry at a very young age. This is at a time when people would start to work early. He was born in New York, but they moved out to the Cleveland area in Ohio. He went to high school out there, and very kind of short trade school afterwards, but got involved in the oil industry. And this is at a time when the late 1800s, industry is growing. The automobile will soon be invented, and there's going to be a growing demand for oil. At first, kind of at the beginning of his life, oil was, not really worth anything. There's not much you could do with it outside of maybe lamps. But soon enough, by the end of his life, and as you know today, oil is incredibly valuable for transportation, for heating, for energy. And Rockefeller is really going to exploit that. He is going to create an oil monopoly through horizontal integration. He would have an oil company, Standard Oil, and lower his prices to incredibly low prices, so low that nobody could compete with him. So other oil industries would be going out of business because nobody's buying their oil, they're all buying his. So once he buys up these others, then he jacks up the prices and he buys everybody out. And at one point, he controlled about 90% of all the oil in the United States. And his wealth is estimated to have peaked at about, like today's value would be about $400 billion. and they think he controlled about 2% of the entire economy. So think about the entire American economy, how big that is. Hundreds of millions of people, he controlled 2% of it. And he really believed in survival of the fittest, that kind of social Darwinism, which will dominate this era, where these guys would justify their actions saying, hey, look, it's rough out there, survival of the fittest. Just like Darwin says about nature, it's survival of the fittest here in America. And that's what is going to really allow laissez-faire policies of government to thrive, because it's going to be hands-off, survival of the fittest. And it really led to a rough life for the majority of Americans. Your workers are going to struggle with low wages for a long time, in terrible working conditions, living in slums, very, very poorly built tenement homes, while at the same time, Rockefeller dominating life and the government. And here, another political cartoon we'll look at. You can see the message here. John D. Rockefeller, a massive, powerful guy. The whole government is running on oil. It's pumping right out of the Congress. And here he is looking at the White House. And the title of this cartoon is, "What a Funny Little Government." He's analyzing it there and looking who's inside the White House and dominating the Treasury Department, spewing out fumes from oil as well. Look at all those oil barrels lined up in front of that Standard Oil refinery, which is actually the United States government. So our robber barons here, incredibly powerful, incredibly wealthy, but at the expense of the average American worker and immigrants who slave away for very low wages and terrible work conditions. And that's why we'll look at next what's known as the progressive era, when things try to progress and our workers are going to come together to form unions, to go on strike, to try to work for better working conditions. You're going to have the trust busters, like Teddy Roosevelt famously breaking up these monopolies. And Rockefeller's monopoly would be broken up into essentially almost all the gas companies you know of today, so Exxon being probably the most well-known. So just as a little exit ticket here, look at these guys. It's, I think, a great cartoon to help you remember them and remember who's who. You have the Steel King there, the Trust King with his banking and cap, and then the Oil King there as well on the right, and the cartoons to help you remember who is who. So you can obviously think back to your notes and come up with who is the Steel King, the Trust King, and the Oil King between Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and John D. Rockefeller. So hopefully you learned a little bit about who these robber barons were, how they became so wealthy, and the effect it had on America. The next unit, like I said, will look at the progressive era and how things changed for the better for most Americans in the United States. But thanks for following along, and stay tuned for more lessons from Students of History. Take care.